Welcome to Career Practitioner Conversations. This podcast is presented by the National Career Development Association. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Melissa Venable, NCDA Director of Professional Development, and this episode continues our 2025 DEI Symposium Series with a conversation about empowering underrepresented students as they prepare for today's workforce. I'm here with Dr. Alicia Monroe and Ruben Britt. So thank you both so much for bringing this conversation to the podcast.
Thank you, Melissa. I am now former Assistant Director for the Office of Career Advancement and former adjunct at Rowan University and former host of Career Talk. But I am also the co-chair for the Diversity Initiative Cultural Inclusion Committee for the National Career Development Association. I'm also co-author with my presenter, Dr. Alicia Monroe, entitled Don't Dismiss My Story, The Tapestry of Colonized Voices in White Spaces. I'd like to also now introduce my co-presenter, Dr. Alicia Monroe, who will share a little bit about her background as well.
Good day. Thank you, Ruben. I am Dr. Alicia Monroe. I currently sit in higher education spaces. However, I am a pre-K through 20 educator of over 30 years. I serve as assistant director, and I am actively serving as assistant director for strategic initiatives, and I serve as adjunct faculty in the Rick Edelman College of Communication, Humanities, and Social Sciences, as well as the College of Education. So thank you again, Ruben, for introducing me into the space, and thank you, Dr. Venable, for providing this opportunity for us to share.
The title of our presentation is No Barriers, No Disruptions, Solutions, Empowering Underrepresented Students for Multicultural and Multi-General Workforce. And before we begin, we just kind of want to give you an overview in terms of what we're going to cover. First, we, as customary in our presentations, we generally conduct a land acknowledgement, and then we're going to examine the intergenerational conflicts within the workforce, and we'll have the opportunity to validate personal truths and narratives of underrepresented students, along with self-reflection on cultural competencies and barriers, identify best practices for inclusive and intrusive career preparation. And then we're also going to provide strategies to support underrepresented students to explore career options. So with regards to norms, I'm going to have Dr. Monroe share information regarding norms.
So our norms sit as we're going to go slow in order to gain momentum to go fast. And as Ruben mentioned, critical reflection takes time. So as we think about the multi-generational workforce that we serve, we think about the career trends, we think about the current climate of the global economy and the workforce. Let's think about who we are in the spaces where we serve our students, our families, our stakeholders, and ourselves. So we're going to go slow in order to gain momentum to go fast. We encourage open and honest conversation. So think openly and candidly, and to thine own self be true. Think about shifting your paradigms and your personal positions and how you're understanding and gaining new understandings and insights, and how will these new understandings and insights challenge mental models that you actually function with and through every day. Take some risk, and we encourage you in your questioning and critical reflection inquiry process to take risks, to try something new, and to think new thoughts. So with that in mind, we always offer a land acknowledgement, and the land acknowledgement that we did present actually focuses on the territory in which we convened for an NCDA convention. But what we want to do always is stand in honor the indigenous nations that occupied the territory first. So please, we want you to honor the indigenous nations, acknowledge the contributions and their legacy, and really think about how are we supporting the rights of all indigenous nations. Ruben, how about telling us a little bit about the current demographic of the American workforce?
Well, the current demographic of the American workforce has been changing, as we know. And what we're seeing now is an increase of underrepresented individuals in the workforce as opposed to the majority non minority groups, such as nowadays the makeup of the American workforce consists of now 61% white, 18% Hispanic, 13% Black, African American, 6% Asian, including subgroups such as East, Southeast, and South Asia. And then there are other groups, including Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and individuals identifying with two or more races. The other thing that we see that's really truly growing is the representation of women. 40% of the workforce consists of women. Gender diversity is evolving with a growing awareness and inclusion of intersectional identifiers. And then we look at the other piece of the workforce involves the generations, such as baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and each generation brings unique perspective, needs, and preferences and influence the workforce culture. And that's so important as we see this evolving workforce.
So when you talk about race and ethnicity, we talk about gender, and we talk about generations and the generational differences. And we're going to really start to unpack that throughout our time together. Let's really hone in on the differences between race and culture for the purpose of our listeners to really understand exactly what our target is. The difference between race and culture is important because, as Ruben talked about, race and ethnicity, we really must understand that race is a social construct of classification. It's a classification system that is really defined by individuals to place people in certain categories, certain classifications, whereas culture is very different. We all have culture. Culture is who we are. Culture is our DNA. Culture, as Ruben pointed to a bit earlier, is our identity. That's who we are. That's our tradition. That's our beliefs. That's our values. And that is organic. Where race is something, a construct that has been established as part of a system of sorting individuals, DNA is organic and DNA is who we are. So, therefore, that is our culture. With that, we have to understand that organically, as humans that represent the beautiful cultures and the mosaic, there are stuff that we carry that is seen, and there are things that are in our invisible backpacks that we do not see. The invisible backpack maps back to trauma informed practices and relationship building. I always reference, and I reference in the book that Ruben and I co authored, a graphic image around the invisible backpack that many of us are familiar with by @SpoonieG. Just because we carry it well doesn't mean it isn't heavy. In talking about that, right, how are we building relationships with a beautiful intersectionality of students that represent multiple cultures to really serve their needs and to support them in their college to career journey. Ruben, tell us a little bit more about communicative action.
As you talked about relationships, building relationships, community action is so imperative in being successful in our profession. And there's a quote by Stephen Covey that says the biggest communication problem is that we do not listen to understand, we listen to reply. And when you look at that particular statement, it's so appropriate because all too often we generally listen to a reply, basically focusing on coming up with a response to what the person says, but we never really provide full attention to understanding the person's point of view, their feelings, and the message that they're trying to convey. So there are major cultural factors and generation conflicts as a result of this because we don't understand each other and we don't seek to understand each other. And working style and the use of technology, these are major conflicts, particularly in the workplace. And then finally, there's a failure to share knowledge and experience with each other. Somebody trying to hide something from the other person because they have information on it, or they're more technology sound than the other person, but they don't really want to share information. But the bottom line is you're supposed to be, you're looking at a workplace that's supposed to be team oriented. And when you have these types of conflicts, a lot of times production is often stalled, and sometimes things don't get done. And then, of course, it creates a personal conflict between individuals within that particular department or within that particular workplace. And then the thing that's so important is that we all possess social identities that shape how we speak, hear, respond, and act. And race and ethnicity is so imperative. And I think about this as a parent. I always try to expose my children to different types of culture because so they would be able to be in a position one day to understand culture, traditions, beliefs, values, and norms. We've gone to different ethnic programs, and of course, we've visited many different types of ethnic restaurants as well. And then there's also that age and generational gap that is so important that we understand people from both generations. Maybe somebody might be from the baby boomer generation, needs to understand people from Gen Z, Gen X, millennials. It's a two-way street. And then most important, understand people from different genders as well, and the feelings that they may experience because of their gender. And then, of course, individuals from sexual orientation as well, which has become a major issue. But of course, this new administration is pretty much trying to create a even bigger conflict with people from different sexual orientation. And then, of course, the religions. And we one of the things that Dr. Monroe and I have done, even when we've conducted workshops, particularly on interviewing, we talked about appropriate dress. And one of the slides that we showed that we have candidates who may be Muslims, and they should be allowed to wear a hair wrap to an interview, or somebody might should be allowed to wear a turban but still dress appropriately. And then they have political affiliations, which really has become a major problem because it's gotten to the point where there's sometimes you see conflict. And then, of course, there are things that people may be able to identify with sports, hobbies, interests. You'd be surprised. And so a lot of times this all goes back to that communicative action, because therefore when you're communicating, you're able to understand people a lot better. And we know that sports and music has always been a way to break down boundaries.
I love this conversation even more now than when we presented it, right? Because, Ruben, this is exactly how we discuss this really critical work. It's about consciousness. I went back to thinking about the quote that you shared from Stephen Covey, right? What is the communication problem? Is we need to listen to understand. That means we have to process this stuff. We started with norming the space, and that's how we started with our mental model is not everyone else's mental model. Diversity starts in our minds and how we really embrace it. Understanding diversity is understanding that every individual besides ourselves is diverse. There are things that we have in common, but there are things that could really fortify our community from others if we just open ourselves up for new avenues of learning. So at this moment in time, we're going to pause for just a brief second so I could share a self-reflection exercise with you. Let's think about, just because I carry it well, it doesn't mean it isn't heavy. What are our students saying to us? Again, what are our students saying to us? The wonderful students that represent different faith-based backgrounds, LGBTQIA plus populations, those who have diverse race and ethnicities, gender differences, our neurodiverse populations. What are our students saying to us? Are we actively listening, or are we listening to reply? And how are we responding to them? Again, what are our students saying to us? Are we actively listening, or are we listening to reply? And how are we responding to them? Ruben, tell us a little bit more about communicative actions and best approaches, practices, and strategies.
Yes, in response to what you just said, one of the misconceptions that educators have is that students can tell if you really care. And communicative action is an important element in being successful as a school counselor, career counselor, principal, administrator, is that establishes a common understanding through open and honest communication that unapologetically, focuses on truth, justice, and authentic engagement. And it's so true because as educators, it's important that we also learn from the students. So when we have that important dialogue, a communicative action dialogue with our students, we are able to understand them. We learn from them as well. Because the thing about it is that we need to know that and listen to them. As I said before, you cannot learn from talking, but you can learn from listening. And and in this day and age, students are going through a lot. And that's why it's so important to have a communicative action in the process of education, because now you're able to understand the situations that they're going through. And sometimes people from different generations may not look at things that way. Say, well, when I was growing up, we did this. But it's different. I can tell you this from my experience. The students that I work with today are different from the students that I worked with even 10 years ago. And so it's so important to have that type of dialogue between you as an educator and the student. And understanding cultural and generational difference is so important. There's a quote by Jesse Jackson that says, "We must turn to each other and not on each other." And so that's why it's so important to have this type of dialogue and in the process with your students. And that's why with Dr. Monroe has emphasized so often authenticality. You're going to talk about authentically engaged communities. Can you shed some light on that?
Absolutely. And Ruben, before we do that, we have to really understand who's in our spaces.
Right.
And I just want to really focus and drill down on just the generational differences between the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, and the Gen Y, our millennials, and then our first digital natives, our Gen Zers. We all share in the same space. And with the introduction of technology to the workforce, and we could talk about AI and Chat GPT, the dynamic shifts. It's an automatic shift in the dynamic where active listening and listening to understand rather than listening to reply becomes a critical imperative in the workforce. So authentic engagement is no longer the pie in the sky theory, that theoretical frame that, I tinkered with around my dissertation and has now evolved to the authentically engaged community framework, Ruben, that sits in our book, Don't Dismiss My Story, right? The tapestry of colonized voices in white space. It's now become an activated framework where we're looking at the me, the who am I, coming in connection and community with the who are we, right? So that's the me plus the others to create this sense of community around a shared meaning. And what connects us is the human quality of empathy. But empathy is not implied. Empathy must be intentional. Empathy must be exuded. Empathy is not just an indicator, right, that sits on the margin. Empathy is a stimulus, a catalyst, and an activator of shared meaning. That means, and we're going to unpack some of this, and Ruben, I'm going to ask you to uplift and amplify some of these pieces in the next area and section of what we're discussing, but that means there must be respect. There must be acceptance. There must be trust in a community space as we move towards an active understanding. We have to feel safe. And if we feel safe as employees, staff, educators, faculty in the educational space, then our students in turn feel safe. How are we uplifting every voice? Or is it still autocratic, where there are one or two stakeholders groups that dictate what is right for all? And within that, we have to understand that everyone else doesn't understand or accept our mental model. So forgiveness is one of the most critical variables of authentic engagement, but it's the hardest one for us to achieve and really do well. Thank you, Ruben. Next.
And when we look at the characteristics of authentic engagement in the workplace, we have to go back to what you just said. Number one, you must establish respect. You also must be flexible and accommodating. And more important, you must avoid stereotyping. And we see that.
Ruben, do me a favor. Stop right there. Let's unpack this stereotyping a bit. We talk about that a lot, micro and macroaggressions.
Yes.
Could you share a little bit more on that?
Yes. All too often, and I can say this I use as a perfect example. I was interviewing candidates for a graduate internship position in my office. And I hired this person. This person was the best candidate. And there was a colleague at the college that said, "Hey, do you know that she's gay?" And I said, "I didn't." So what's so important about that? I said, "I didn't put that in the job description. You know, I hired her because she was the best candidate. I wasn't, but had it been for him, who might have had a position, he might have eliminated her because of her sexual orientation. And all too often, we see that even with underrepresented students. I had a student who who was a really good writer, and he submitted a paper in class, and the teacher accused him of plagiarism. And he wrote that paper from scratch. This is way before AI, and he wrote it from scratch. And all too often, we see individuals who stereotype people, and sometimes they even use inappropriate language when they're talking about people. And I know in my position, I'm quick to correct them.
So I'm going to let you know, Ruben, I just wanted to stop here because I know you have stories to tell about this, right? So think about the exclusion just because of race and sexual orientation. That micro leads to a macro, which could legitimately exclude a highly qualified candidate from a job just because of personal mental models and paradigms, just because the I sits in a place of control and power, not understanding or wanting to understand the we. Authentic engagement says that we have to stretch our own selves and be willing to do it first with ourselves before we look outside to have everyone else do the hard work. Interrogate ourselves first. Please go on. Thank you for sharing that, Ruben.
And most importantly, you must also honor diversity and be inclusive. As I mentioned earlier, we need to learn from one another. And when we learn from one another, it encourages employees to accept change and lead by example. We also must identify trends across generations, seek and establish business norms that suit everybody. And when we do that, we also have to create a safe environment where employees can learn and grow. And it's important that we tailor our communication styles to the different employees that we work with. And you had talked about previously about we're understanding students, neurodivergent students, and that I've hired neurodivergent students as graduate interns as well. And so when working with whether it's neurodivergent, other underrepresented students, sometimes you have to tailor your communication style. And more importantly, because of you have a better understanding of people from different backgrounds, you can approach them differently, but still getting out the same message to each and every one of the people that you work with. It's just a different communication style. And I always say sometimes you can call it's another form of being bilingual by tailoring your communication style.
Ruben, it's wonderful that you say that because I know you're gonna next tell us what is truly career ready, but we have to really think about and what you're discussing is what is empathy, right? Empathy is developing an understanding and compassion for someone else who is diverse, right? That's that person sitting right next to you, You might have some commonality, but diversity starts with the next person in the room. We could all be from the same family. We could all be along the same lineage, but there is diversity there. So it's to really honor and respect that so that we can have different ways of seeing things, being innovative with thoughts that are unlike our own to really push and move forward and advance. So thank you for sharing that.
Being career ready is really important aspect, particularly as career practitioners, because all too often students are traumatized, and it stunts their development to be career ready because they're traumatized by dream killers, and then there's which leaves them feeling, doubting their qualifications, even though they've spent 4 or 5 whatever years in college to in a particular major to qualify for a particular career. But when these particular boundaries are torn down, it helps students become career ready to qualify for and succeed in post-secondary job training or education, and makes them qualify to be ready for the career of their choice.
And unfortunately, for some, there's no through line. There are guardrails that are up, right? There are obstacles in the way. And therefore, cultural proficiency is a competency, it's a skill set, it's something that must be worked on, and it should be intentional. Cultural proficiency is a mindset, it's a way of being, it's a state of mind, it's a condition that esteems others. It esteems the person right next to you while positively engaging and adapting and responding. So we're positively engaging, right? Because we're seeking to understand, right? Stephen Covey says we must understand, not seek to just reply, right? We're seeking to understand, be adaptive, and respond. And the difference between cultural unhealthy cultural proficiency practices and healthy cultural proficiency practices, according to the cultural proficiency framework, is understanding different worldviews. I really remember sitting down and working on this with many brilliant educators, working and toiling and asking a lot of questions, gleaning data, doing the research around this cultural proficiency framework. And as we looked at the morality, the ethical parameters, we looked at all of that. But most simply put, and it is a complex frame because it is a human-based approach, the main difference between unhealthy, culturally competent practices and healthy, culturally competent practices are, or I should say, is the fact that we all have differing worldviews. So as we move the who am I into the who are we, thinking around the authentically engaged framework, we really need to understand who are we serving? Who are the stakeholders that we serve? Who are our students? Who are the faculty? Who are our colleagues? Who are the administrators? Who are our community constituents? Who are our families? Who are we serving? How do we even serve ourselves? Because what we all want to move from is we want to move from a strong sense of our own self-agency to self-efficacy and self-authorship. So if we're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're moving from the basic tier of physical needs to the higher order tiers of our physiological and psychological needs. The essential elements of the cultural proficiency framework are we have to assess the culture. So we have to call out and name the differences in our workspaces. Then we have to value the diversity, right? Not put the guardrails up, not silo, not isolate, not thinking that our mental model is correct and everyone must assimilate to the way we think. It's how are we coming into community? So, how are we valuing diversity? Then, how do we manage the dynamics of difference? I'm going to sit there for a minute. Carrying it well. Just because I look good, how do I carry it? Just because I carry it well doesn't mean the burden is light. So, how do we manage the dynamics of differences? We didn't even talk about the trauma of our students. We didn't even talk about our own trauma. We can see the social classifications and maybe we can hear it as we develop relationships. But what about the stuff that's not seen? Some students are unhoused. Some students are food insecure. Some students are immigrants and they don't feel safe. I could go on and on and on. Some students don't feel like they could trust the space so that they can reveal and come out with their identities. I want to let you know it's not only students. What about the colleague that's sitting in the cubicle or the office in front of you or next to you? How are we developing an authentically engaged community? Then how do we adopt the workplace environment for diversity? These are questions that we should be asking ourselves. These are how we should be challenging one another. This is how we should be charging the culture and climate of our workspaces if we are ready to accept a diverse student population that are fired up and ready to go, right? And then how do we institutionalize cultural knowledge where we are making intentional changes for differences?
And some of the solutions for breaking down these barriers is to provide professional development training on cultural competencies and implicit bias. And one of the exercises that I use in my class, and it's also in the book, Don't Dismiss My Story, The Tapestry of Colonized Voices in White Space, is what is your experience with people from different cultures? What is your knowledge from people from different cultures? Is it from the media? Is it from what somebody told you or your parents or whatever? But understanding them from personal experiences and learning. The other thing is it involves connect students with professionals from similar backgrounds and of career interests that will help them, because it also helps them in terms of preparing them for the career. Sometimes organizations or people in these professions will allow students to do some shadowing as well. It's so imperative to partner with inclusive employers to offer internships, as I mentioned before, and shadowing opportunities. Because if these employers are not the type of employers who are exclusive, then that's not the type of environment students or should be looking to find jobs with. And that's why it's important to establish relations with student groups and organizations. And we've done that, Dr. Monroe. We've partnered with different organizations such as the Divine Nine, which consists of Black fraternities and Black sororities, and we've done programs with them. We've also attended programs at different organizations that represent underrepresented students host. We have the student NAACP chapter at Rowan that we attended their different events, and so when they see us at these particular events, they're more apt to reach out to us. They're more apt to come to us for resources, for access to information that can help them in their career journey. And then as a result of these different types of programs, we're able to highlight success stories of underrepresented alumni and leaders in various professions. professions. And as you know, I've had a number of these individuals on the radio show called Career Talk. And I asked them candid questions in terms of challenges that they faced along their career journey. And so when we look at a multicultural, generational collaboration, a perfect example of how cultural and multi-generational generations come together is in 2000, the album by Carlos Santana, which was entitled Supernatural. Now, this particular album was the success of this album. First, I'll talk about the success of the album. The album won 9 Grammy Awards, and breaking the record held by Michael Jackson's Thriller. The other thing is that it was #1 in 11 countries, including the United States, for 12 non-consecutive weeks, where it was certified 15 platinum. Platinum is 1 million copies sold. And this album's success was attributed to the collaboration of 3 different generations. We had a collaboration of Generation X, which consisted of Wyclef Jean and Lauryn Hill. We had the baby boomer representative that included Carlos Santana. And then we had a representative from the silent generation, which is before the baby boomer generation, of Clive Davis. The silent generation, which is where students were seen but not heard. The baby boomers changed that philosophy and said, hey, we're speaking out, no more war. But anyways, the collaboration of Generation X, baby boomer, and silent generation created a masterpiece that, as a result of everybody having a voice, everybody having an input in the album, and because everybody respected everybody's point of view, ideas, the album was a masterpiece.
So I love this example, Ruben, which prompts me to add some thinking around the difference between belonging and mattering. So if we're looking at the authentically engaged community, and empathy is driving, and all the variables, right? Those human elements are sitting within that space to come about shared meaning, right? Think about this collaboration, right? Because the multiple intersections weren't even identified. You stayed within the generational. The culture is all here, and it's wonderfully represented within this collaboration. So it was much more than belonging, because they are part of an incredible music community. Each one within themselves are icons in the music community. But what made the collaboration so successful is they mattered to each other. They mattered. That means that I value you. I esteem your gifts. I honor and dignify who you are in this space. And mattering also implies that if you are not in this space, you are missed. So how are we serving our students? We've provided solutions. We said that there are no disruptions and no interferences, because we are solution-based as practitioners. I want us to think about, how are we weaving our community? Thus, we land on our final thought for our session. This is entitled Weaving a Warm Blanket, also found in our book. I want you to think of yourselves as a fine thread in a blanket, and you are strong within yourselves, But what is the functionality of a blanket? The functionality of a blanket is to bring some sort of layers so that we can become warm. So therefore, we know that one strong thread is not going to make that happen for us. Two won't. Many won't. What we need to do with these threads are start to weave together. A loose weave brings a pattern, but we're still not achieving the functionality of the blanket. It's when we start to tighten, and come together as one. Sooner or later, we reach that tipping point. We reach that point where we achieve the functionality of the blanket. In other words, we reach the space where we become community. This is important. So I ask you, as we think about no barriers, no disruptions, only solutions for not only underrepresented students, all students, how do we serve them? And how do you know we are serving them well? It has truly been a joy. Thank you so much, Mr. Britt, Dr. Venable, for being in the space. Ruben, I am definitely going to give you the last word, but I do want all of our listeners to think about, how do we serve? And how do you know that we are serving them well?
And it's important to note that we are a rising tide, uplifting our students, our culture, our colleagues, and our craft. And by doing that, we must have respect for each other, respect for the students, respect for their cultural backgrounds. And it's important for us as educators to also be lifelong learners. And part of being a lifelong learner is learning from each other, learning from our students, learning from people from different generations. Because as the quote says, until the lion tells a story, the hunter will always be the hero. Thank you, Dr. Monroe, and thank you, Alicia Venable, for allowing us this opportunity to present.